Hey guys, Booligan here with Booligan Shooting Sports. Today I'm going to do a little bit of an informational and historical information video on the Steyr M357. Let's go ahead and take a look at this thing on the bench and go over a little bit about this very interesting firearms history and if it might be an interesting gun to add to your collection if you happen to find one. So picture it's the 1990s and all of the polymer frame handgun business is pretty much going to one company, and that would be Glock. Glock makes perfectly competent handguns, and especially back in the 1990s, they didn't really have a ton of competition as far as the polymer handguns go. A designer who lived in Austria approached Glock with some design ideas and said, hey guys, you guys make good handguns, but I've got a couple of ideas here. And Glock promptly said, thanks, but no thanks. We're not interested in what you're selling. So he decided to take his ideas down the street to Steyr's factory. And Steyr, not wanting to kind of lose out on that polymer pistol money, they said, hey, do you know what? Yeah, let's go ahead and let's hear what this guy has to say. So they took some of his ideas and ended up creating the M series of pistols. They were available in several different calibers, and they all started basically from the 40 caliber cartridge. The thing to recall is at this time with the 40 caliber cartridge, with Glocks in particular, Glocks in general started 9mm. So when they made the move in that same frame design from a 9mm to a 40, they had to cut out a large portion of the bottom of the barrel, bottom of the chamber. And with some ammunition, with some reloads, with things like that, they ran into certain problems, and Glocks were kind of known at the time for very rarely turning into hand grenades, especially when using the 40 caliber cartridge. With the 40 caliber cartridge and the upcoming 357 SIG cartridge starting to gain some momentum, Steyr decided to design this from the ground up for that 40 caliber cartridge, and in turn for the 357 SIG cartridge. Because of that, these guys have fully supported chambers, and the feed geometry is designed around that. So these were sort of, the idea behind some of these was to make a safer, better shooting handgun that was a little bit more reliable than the Glocks. Let's go over some of the design features of this particular one. Verify we're operating with an empty handgun. First thing that you'll notice is this grip. It has an extremely high groove up here for your hand, which allows you to get your hand very high up on the pistol, and it pretty much eliminates any chance of slide bite there. You'd have to be doing something catastrophically wrong to get slide bite with this. Comparing it to something like my CZ P10, if you sort of lay them barrel to barrel, it's a little tricky, but you can see how much higher the grip angle is on the Steyr, and just allows you to get your hand higher up and to help give you a lower bore axis compared to something like that CZ, and especially something like the Glocks, especially the Glocks of the time. It has a grip angle designed for natural point shooting, and it really does kind of excel at that. You point and shoot, and it does what it's supposed to. This is sort of before the time of wanting to have fully ambidextrous controls. As such, you have one magazine release that is not reversible on this model to eject the mags, which pop free. As far as safeties go, they differed from Glock by adding a manual safety. you can see, well, there's a couple of different safeties on this. There's obviously your internal safeties, your drop safety and things like that. There's also this trigger safety, meaning you fully have to commit to pulling the trigger in order for it to fire. If you just pull back the trigger, it does not fire. You have to be pulling that back. There is this manual safety up front, which it looks sort of like this big lever here, especially when it says F and S. That's for something completely different. This manual safety pulls down, and you now have, zoom in a little bit on that, you now have this white dot visible here. That tells you that the safety's engaged. To disengage the safety, which is kind of a little counterintuitive to most of us, you have to stick your finger inside the mag well and lift that up. That means that the safety, and there is a matching one on the other side, is fully ambidextrous, can be manipulated with either hand. In addition to that, you will notice this right here. This is another safety. Using a key, which is included in the package, you can actually lock out the gun, that, and rotating it. Now what happens, the safety can be turned off, the gun cannot be disassembled, you can't flip down the disassembly lever, and you can't pull the trigger, the gun won't fire. So it is effectively locked out. There were two variants of these. It's not a fancy key or anything, it's just kind of a general metal shape. But there were two versions. The first one is for this key, and the second one uses a standard handcuff key. Up front, you'll notice this is before the time of rail mounted everything, and there's no rail interface up here. Instead, there are these rectangular notches on either side, of which proprietary accessories can clamp on. That being said, this gun was realistically a financial failure. I mean, it may not have been a financial failure. I don't exactly have access to Steyr's finances, but it was a commercial failure. Especially these very, very early generation 1 models, they just did not get any sort of traction in the US market. So you didn't see a ton of accessories or things out there for it. However, you'll very, very rarely see them pop up on eBay, but there are interfaces that are designed for that. I believe there's one that allows you to mount a rail. There is no market for accessories for this gun, so if I were to design and 3D print a mount for that, it would basically just be for me, because nobody else has these things. On the other side, nothing really to speak of. Like I mentioned before, there's that magazine release, and then a very nicely angled, get a good angle on there, but a very nicely angled slide release and slide lock, which really, really lets you get a good purchase of it in order to manipulate that as needed. On the slide, you'll notice this is a striker fired handgun. It has these very cool sights, which we'll talk about in a second. And at the rear, this little circle right here protrudes when a cartridge is loaded in the chamber. So you do have a loaded chamber indicator that is both visual and tactile. You can reach, feel, and see, yes, I do have a cartridge loaded. The sights are something that Steyr really kind of went all in on, and you'll see they even committed to it as part of their design work. You've got trapezoids and triangles. At the rear, these are not glow or tritium or phosphorescent or anything. These are just standard white on this model, but night sights were available. But you have this trapezoid at the rear with these two white bars and this triangle at the front. And when you align them, they create quite a nice little sight picture. A lot of people thought this was weird, and it is weird. I mean, I still think it's a pretty weird design, but it actually, in use, aligns quite quickly, because if the natural point when you point and shoot, if that doesn't align the sights, your eye and body kind of wants to naturally bring that triangle up so that it is perfectly placed there, and then you just put that tip of the triangle at the bottom of your sight, you're in business. That was probably one of the reasons that these things failed, though, is it was a weird gun from a company that not many people had heard of. It had a manual safety, which was not necessarily a popular thing at the time when these came out. I believe in 1999 or early 2000. It was not necessarily a feature that everybody wanted on a handgun. So due to that and the lack of Steyr's marketing department in the United States completely, these just did not do very well financially. They did continue the model on, and you can find like M9 A1s and A2, and I think up to like an A4 model, I believe. But they did keep doing new generations and new generations of the 9mm mainly. The 357 SIG did not do particularly well. Now, for this one that I purchased, I came across locally, and this guy is effectively brand new. It really doesn't look like it's been fired very much, if at all. Includes the case. Inside the case includes the grand total of 4 magazines. 3 of the magazines are the 12 round capacity, and you'll see these are restricted, law enforcement, government use, and or export only 9/14/1994. So these are during the ban on what would be considered high capacity magazines. So what the gun actually came with is this 10 rounder with this little plastic extension there on the bottom. This is also the only one that I believe came originally with the gun, because it's the only one that is marked 357 SIG, whereas these are all marked 40 Smith & Wesson. If you can find them, these are actually pretty hard to come by and pretty expensive. It also included the tool and the manual. The manual's kind of funny. You'll notice there's this big old sticker on the back. These were originally imported by GSI Incorporated. And then at some point early on, it was decided, no, GSI is not going to import them, and now Xander's Sporting Goods is going to import them. And there's a big sticker in the front. It says, whenever GSI Incorporated is mentioned in this manual, please disregard and replace by our US importer Xander's Sporting Goods. No longer best friends with GSI, Xander's Sporting Goods are my best friend now. That actually is reflected on the gun as well. If you look right here, normally this line right here would say GSI, and then have whatever their location is in Alabama, I believe, would be right there on this area that's kind of obliterated. And instead hastily applied underneath GZS, Baldwin, Illinois. GZS being whatever the acronym is for Xander Sporting Goods. Goods, Xander Sporting, I have no idea. Baldwin, Illinois. So it's kind of interesting, and this is a very, very early production model. The date code GOO on the slide indicates that this was produced in the middle of the year 2000. So this guy is 21 years old, and realistically doesn't seem like it has ever fired a shot, to be honest. It just is in immaculate condition. But yeah, it's just a little bit interesting that there was a importer changeover basically the year this thing was introduced, and now it just is homeless because I don't think Xander's still exists. GSI may or may not still exist. But yeah, Steyr certainly exists, but good luck finding, too many parts for these outside of Gunbroker or other similar resources, maybe eBay. So a little bit about how this handles and why I'm actually really kind of disappointed that this design didn't take off. Again, we are working with an empty chamber, an empty magazine. I am going to be dry firing this a little bit just to sort of give you guys an idea of how this thing handles and how it would shoot. As I mentioned before, it fits the hand extremely well. I have very big hands, got big meaty paws here, but this thing, being roughly Glock 19 sized, fits my hand very, very well. Just a little bit of fat hand overhang there on the bottom. The trigger pull on it is really, really good. Once obviously you pull back that trigger safety that doesn't take any effort, you don't have very much take up at all, and then fires. But where it really shines is on the reset. So watch my finger. It is now reset. There is a minuscule amount of travel. That's it. Maybe 4 or 5 millimeters of return travel, and you have a good audio and tactile reset, and it's ready to shoot again. This trigger is shockingly good for what this gun is. If you look at something like a early 2000s era factory Glock, the trigger is nowhere near as good as this. It's just exceptionally good. With that really low bow axis and your ability to get a high grip up here, you can stay on target easily, relatively speaking for the caliber, but you can handle your recoil well and you can stay on target relatively easily. Let's see if I remember my order of operations here for disassembly. It needs to be... There we go. Disassembly is a piece of cake. Just super, super simple for cleaning. You just flip that little lever down. You can sort of see the rails here and the way that they're shaped. They're also shaped like sort of a trapezoidal rail design, which is pretty beefy, especially at the rear there. Just really, really good handling, easy to clean, easy to maintain guns. Why did they fail? Well, the big one is just because Steyr doesn't do any marketing and they weren't Glocks. If it wasn't a Glock, it wasn't going to sell particularly well to the US market. A couple of police departments picked these up. They didn't do particularly well because you don't have a ton of after-sale support because they didn't sell very well. It's sort of a self-defeating concept there where if the gun doesn't sell, obviously there's not going to be many people out there making holsters for it or making spare magazines for it. So everything is going to just kind of fall apart as far as after sales support. And then when you've got even the importers switching, from one company to another in the first year of production of this gun, and you just have a recipe for failure. Now, if this particular one, I'm going to have some hot takes here, so be prepared if you like, but this is chambered in 357 SIG, and that's one of the reasons why I actually got this one. One, I think it's an interesting and I think kind of brutalistically attractive handguns. It's really, there's not much no fuss, it's just a gun. I do really like those funky sights. They're really, really easy to acquire and easy to shoot. But the other reason why is because this is chambered in 357 SIG. And 357 SIG is sort of an oddity as far as calibers go. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Somebody sat down in the mid-1990s and said, what if we got 357 Magnum performance out of a smallish repeating handgun? And someone said, brilliant, we'll print all of the money, invent this round. And they took a 10mm round and they necked it down to fit a 9mm bullet. And that's sort of a long story short of why the 357 SIG exists. The problem being, the 357 SIG round doesn't necessarily do anything better on a practical level than modern 9mm loadings. Yes, it has a bit higher muzzle energy. A lot of people will say that, if we're talking terminal ballistics, 9mm has nothing on, the big power of the 357 SIG. Sure, but if you look at the actual ballistics testing, both a good shooting 9mm in a comparable size and this shooting 357 SIG are going to put a 9mm bullet that's going to expand out to about half an inch, about 12 to 16 inches into ballistics gelatin. You're going to have the same effect on target. What stops gunfights is realistically putting the largest number of adequately sized holes in your target to either, one, disrupt the blood flow enough that their brain effectively shuts down because of a rapid loss of blood pressure and loss of blood. Two, breaking bones, severing the spinal cord, or disruption of brain material. This is destruction of the nervous system. And this, the 357 SIG round, does not necessarily do that any better than modern 9mm loadings. Take a look at how the 357 SIG round looks. So you can see that sort of bottleneck cartridge there. What 357 SIG does exceptionally well, if we're going to talk about things it does a great job at, makes big fireballs, especially out of something with a short barrel like this. You're going to get big old concussion and muzzle blast coming out of the front. That is going to make repeated shots difficult. It's also very good at breaking guns. The excess wear and tear from 357 SIG in most, especially like a polymer frame platform, is something to consider if you are looking at calibers. It, simply put, shooting the same number of rounds out of a 9mm versus a 357 SIG, you are going to have more wear and tear on the 357 SIG handgun. That's been tested and shown. You lose several rounds. If this were the 9mm version, you would have 14, 15 rounds on deck, versus the biggest you can have with this is 12. So you're losing 2 to 3 rounds to have a slightly punchier cartridge. And that's one of the reasons why, and this is another unpopular opinion, that I think that 357 SIG is not necessarily obsolete. In my short, I said obsolete. That may have been too harsh of a word. Approaching obsolescence might be a more appropriate word to describe the 357 SIG cartridge. But Booligan, what about that that church shooting that got stopped by that guy in one shot, where he one-shot headshotted that guy with a 357 SIG? Clearly it's not an obsolete cartridge then. I never said it's not an effective caliber and not an effective cartridge. It stops people dead, but so does 9mm. But what you get with 9mm versus 357 SIG, one, less muzzle blast, less abrasive recoil, and less muzzle flash, which means it's going to be easier for you to get repeated shots on your target, which might be likely in a gunfight situation. Two, what you get is you get a few extra rounds on deck, just in case you miss, or just in case your target doesn't go down at a pace in which you'd like them to stop. You have more rounds on deck to end that threat. So if that gentleman at that church in Texas, if he had, instead of, I think he had a SIG 229 chambered in 357 SIG, if he had a 229 chambered in 9mm, that guy would still be dead. This was obviously a very well-trained individual, and he would be able to headshot that guy with a 9mm just like he headshotted him with the 357 SIG. The caliber does not make a difference in that specific scenario. With 9mm, you are generally able to practice more, except for in these weird pandemic social unrest times. You're able to practice more because 9mm is usually less expensive and it's usually more available than 357 SIG. Where 357 SIG really comes in handy is in the early days of panic buying, because during a panic buying situation, as we all saw, the first thing to disappear, 9mm and 5.56. Then 40 Smith & Wesson, 45, 380. But what were you still finding on shelves? You were still finding 357 SIG. So having the ability to buy ammunition for your gun is very, very helpful. But now the 357 SIG is gone, and it is not going to be replaced anytime soon with any degree of consistency. It's just not a high demand enough cartridge. You only have a handful of guns from a handful of manufacturers that are chambered in 357 SIG. And there's just not a lot of incentive for a company to, shut down 9mm production for a day and crank out some 357 SIG. So that's my very, very long-winded rant on why 357 SIG is an adequate cartridge. It's great man-stopping power, but really isn't necessary in this day and age. And that's why I think, you're never going to see the caliber completely disappear, but I think that it is going to become harder and harder to come by in the future. And I think that it's going to be harder and harder to find guns that shoot it in the future. And I think it's going to be harder and harder to find parts for those guns in the future. So that's just kind of my very long-winded thoughts on the caliber itself and sort of how it applies to this platform. What will I be doing with this gun? It's sort of an interesting time capsule in the way that it currently sits. It is complete, comes with mags, comes with the box. But as I said, there aren't a ton of spare parts out there for it, so I don't want to shoot the life out of this thing because I may not be able to replace the parts if something does break. However, I do have some 357 SIG ammunition, and I do want to get this out at my next range day in order to, run it through its paces and show you guys how it shoots. The interesting part about these is what the values have done on these. Now, the A1 models have a better grip, and the Gen 2s have a little bit better grip design. I actually really kind of like this with just the ribs in there and the Steyr logo. I think it looks really super cool. And they come up with rails later on in the future and stuff like that. But I really like this one in its sort of simplistic design. It's a very good, carry conceal piece. But the values on these have done very, very weird things. So these were originally like, $350, $400 MSRP guns. They weren't expensive guns, but because specifically these first gen models, some people really, really like that manual safety and they want one with the manual safety. I have seen the values on these guys sell, not just list, but sell for, between $1,000 and over $2,000 for one of these, which is really, really strange. I don't necessarily understand the market. I understand if you're a collector of obsolescent calibers and interesting guns and discontinued guns, then yeah, I can see why. But this is not a $2,000 handgun. Needless to say, I purchased this locally from a local seller for a lot less than that. In fact, I paid less than what you would normally pay for a used Glock for this, even in the before times. So I got a great deal on this, and I'll hold on to it and shoot it and display it and maybe use it to come up with some 3D printed accessories that no one else will want. But there you go. So this is my very, very long-winded oral history and overview of the Steyr series, in particular the Steyr M357. Thank you for sticking through this incredibly long video, and yeah, we'll get a video out at the range with this, see how it does, show you guys the fire-breathing power of the 357 SIG round. Of course, many thanks to the patrons on Patreon for their continued support of the channel, and of course for you guys who continue to watch. Thanks for watching.